August 21st, 1986. Cameroon, West Africa. Just a Thursday night like any other. Farmers had put their livestock in, children were asleep, a woman is cooking over a fire, a man walking home from a neighbor's house. People were living, unremarkably, maybe quietly, the way that people live when nothing bad is about to happen. And then, approximately at 9:30 in the evening, no warning, no earthquake, no volcanic eruption, no fire, and no flood. A lake killed them in their sleep. A lake exhaled. The water didn't even touch them. And around 1,700 people stopped breathing. Welcome to Aqua Diary. I'm Allie, an environmental scientist. And today we're going somewhere that most water scientists won't take you, because most water scientists are still a little stunned that this story is even possible. This is the story of Lake Nyos, the lake that became a weapon unintentionally, and a disaster that nobody saw coming. And the part of the story that most videos leave out entirely is the part that's unresolved, still dangerous, and still happening right now. Let's get into it all. To understand what happened that night, you first need to picture the place. Lake Nyos sits on the northwest highlands of Cameroon in Africa, a region of volcanic craters and green hills. It's a crater lake, meaning that it formed inside the caldera of an ancient volcano. Basically, the circle that you see in the top of a volcano became a lake. And that lake is about a mile wide, 700 feet deep, and sits nearly at 3,000 feet in elevation. By most measures, it was beautiful. The people who lived around it had been there for generations. They farmed and raised cattle, and the lake was a source of water. It was also a landmark and a constant in their lives. It was home. It was also beneath the surface, slowly becoming something else entirely. Directly beneath Lake Nyos, about 50 miles down, sits a pool of magma, active but sleeping. And over decades, maybe even centuries, because that's debated, that magma had been leaking carbon dioxide gas upward through the earth into underground springs, and from those springs, silently, into the bottom of the lake. Here's the thing about carbon dioxide in cold, deep water. Carbon dioxide dissolves under pressure. The deeper the water, the more CO2 it can hold. Lake Nyos was essentially becoming a giant pressurized bottle of carbonated water. Except the carbon was a lethal gas, and nobody was aware this was happening. The lake looked completely normal, the typical blue, still, calm, and the surface looked fine. So this danger was invisible, accumulating in the dark, cold, deep water below. For years and maybe decades, nobody knew about it. And here's the detail that doesn't always make it into the coverage of this story, and it probably should. Lake Nyos was not the first disaster. 2 years earlier, August 15th, 1984, something nearly identical happened at a smaller lake about 60 miles away, Lake Manoon. A CO2 cloud escaped in the night, and 37 people died on a road just near the lake, found slumped over motorcycles and laying on the ground with literally no injuries. The Cameroonian government initially suspected some kind of a terrorist attack, or maybe chemicals dumped in the lake. Among local communities, they suspected that evil spirits were said to have periodically left the waters and taken lives. Scientists eventually concluded that it was probably gas release from the lake, but the investigation at the time was pretty limited. The world didn't pay too much attention, and 2 years later at Lake Nyos, nobody was really ready. At approximately 9:30 p.m., something disturbed the deep water of Lake Nyos. Most geologists believe it was some kind of a landslide or a section of the volcanic rock wall in that caldera slipping into the lake, sending a shock wave down into the CO2 saturated depths. Some think it might have been a small volcanic event on the lake floor, We really don't know for sure. All we really know is what came next. When that cold, gas-saturated water got disturbed, carbon dioxide began to bubble out of solution, pretty much like the moment that you open a shaken soda bottle. And once that started, it couldn't stop. The bubbles made the water less dense, so it rose. And as it rose, that pressure decreased further. Lower pressure meant more CO2 came out, more bubbles, more rising, more gas. It became a runaway chain reaction, and the lake erupted, not with lava or ash, but with invisible gas. An estimated 100,000 to 300,000 tons of carbon dioxide exploded out of Lake Nyos in a matter of minutes. The force of it blasted a water plume approximately 260 feet into the air. The lake literally exploded, and it turned the lake from this beautiful clear blue to a dark red brown. This iron-rich sediment churned up from the bottom, and it colored the water like rust. You can see pictures of this if you look into it. A wave of water surge crashed into the surrounding forest, and it completely stripped trees. And then the cloud of carbon dioxide descended. That cloud moved through the villages below. People were asleep. In the village of Nyos, there were only 4 survivors. Literally only 4. Survivors who woke up described reaching for family members in bed who would not wake up, stepping outside to find cattle laying motionless in fields, goats scattered across compounds, birds, insects, everything just still. No burns on anyone's body or no signs of violence, no wreckage, just silence and the dead. One survivor, Joseph Nickwayne, later described waking up unable to speak, finding his daughter dead beside him, walking to his neighbors' houses to find all of them dead. He got on his motorcycle and rode through the village of Nyos and said, "I did not see any sign of any living thing." By morning, more than 1,700 people were dead. Some sources put it even closer to 1,800, along with about 3,500 head of cattle and countless birds, insects, and wildlife. They all died in 25 kilometers in every direction of that lake like a radius. The cause of death? Asphyxiation. The carbon dioxide had displaced the oxygen in the air. So when carbon dioxide concentration reaches around 10% of the air that you're breathing, you lose consciousness almost instantly. Above 15%, you stop breathing in minutes. Many victims had what appeared to be blistered skin, not from heat or chemicals, but from the pressure of lying unconscious against a surface. Bed sores, essentially, formed in hours because the body was so deprived of oxygen and blood flow that the tissue had already begun to break down. The doctors who arrived there and reported on it had never seen anything like it. Nobody really had. Let me put on my scientist hat for a few minutes because understanding why exactly this happened is what separates this episode from nearly every other Nyos video. Lake Nyos is what scientists call a meromictic lake. That word, meromictic, describes a lake where the water layers do not mix or turn over. In most lakes, seasonal temperature changes cause the surface and the deep water to turn over occasionally, usually in the fall or the spring. The cooler surface water sinks, warmer, deeper water rises, and eventually they mix. That mixing is what keeps the carbon dioxide in this scenario from building up. Meromictic lakes don't really do all of that mixing. The layers stay separated, permanently stratified. The deeper water is colder and denser, and it just stays down there, accumulating whatever is pumped in it from below. And for Lake Nyos, that was carbon dioxide seeping in from the volcanic springs on the lake floor, year after year. Scientists estimate that by 1986, the bottom water of Lake Nyos had accumulated carbon dioxide at pressures of up to 5 times atmospheric pressure. So the lake was holding the equivalent of roughly 90 million metric tons of dissolved carbon dioxide. And the specific trigger, or whatever shook that soda bottle of the lake, is still debated. Most geologists favor the landslide theory. The evidence a fresh scar on the volcanic rock wall above the lake discovered after the disaster. Some researchers have raised the possibility of some kind of small subsurface volcanic event, and a few earlier papers suggested that even heavy rainfall could have disturbed the surface enough to initiate that chain reaction. The honest answer? We don't know for sure what triggered it. We just know about what happened afterward. And once triggered, that process was kind of self-sustaining in a matter of seconds. Gas came out of the water rose, the pressure dropped, more gas came out, and so more water rose over and over and over again. Scientists call it a limnic eruption, from the Latin term for lake. It is one of only 2 events of this type ever recorded in human history, and the other, Lake Manoon, 2 years earlier. And here's the scientific distinction that most coverage misses entirely. This was not really a geological disaster like a lot of people say. It was a water chemistry disaster. It's not like the volcano erupted. The earth didn't shake. The lake's water did something that water almost never does. It kind of erupted on its own. As a water scientist, that distinction matters enormously for understanding what happened here. And so at the end of the day, this is a water story. The water was the weapon. When scientists arrived in the days following the disaster, they found a scene that defied any easy explanations. The Cameroonian government's initial theory, shared publicly, was that a volcanic eruption must have released some kind of poisonous gas. Scientists from France, Japan, the United States, and elsewhere all converged on the lake. What they found immediately challenged that hypothesis. There was no fresh lava anywhere. No disturbed volcanic sediment on the lake floor, consistent with what you would find for a new eruption. There was basically no fresh volcanic rock. The debate that followed was genuinely contentious. At an UNESCO conference in 1987, 2 camps emerged. The volcanic hypothesis, that a subsurface eruption had sent gas directly into the air, and the limnic hypothesis, that gas had been dissolved in the lake's deep water and the lake itself had erupted. The limnic hypothesis is eventually what prevailed, which is what you heard about today. The evidence was in the water chemistry. Extremely high carbon dioxide concentrations in the deeper layers, decreasing towards the surface. This matched a scenario as a kind of gradual accumulation and not just some random or sudden volcanic injection. But the trigger question was really never resolved. And that is something that does matter. If the trigger was a landslide, the lake is still vulnerable to future landslides, and the volcanic rock walls around Nyos are not stable. If it was a minor volcanic event, the magma below the lake is still active and still producing CO2. If heavy rainfall can trigger it, then every storm season carries some inherent risk. The scientists who studied Nyos left with the conclusion that was both relief and warning. This can be prevented, and it can also happen again. After the disaster, the Cameroonian government evacuated the survivors. The village around Lake Nyos were declared a high-risk zone. Approximately 12,000 some people were relocated into what they called resettlement camps, or many of them remained until recently. The village of Nyos itself has been largely abandoned for nearly 40 years. A lot of the houses are still there, the church is still there, the fields are now overgrown, there's no kids. The survivors who were moved to camps say they still want to go home. Some have quietly returned despite multiple government warnings. It's hard to remove a home from a person. The human dimension of the story often gets compressed into statistics, but what happened to Lake Nyos in their community? It's displacement of people that have now nearly lasted 4 decades. Survivors who were young adults in 1986 are now elderly people. And their children grew up in these camps and not in the place that their families have lived in and known for generations. A way of life, a community structure, a culture tied to a landscape. It didn't just get disrupted, that whole way of life might be gone for them. And here's where the story gets genuinely remarkable from a water science and engineering perspective. In the late 1980s, scientists proposed what sounds like pretty much science fiction: degas the lake. Literally pipe the CO2 out. Insert pipes that reach the deep CO2 water, pump it upward, and as the pressure drops And as the gas comes out harmlessly in small quantities and, will eventually disperse into the air instead of erupting all at once and killing people. The beautiful part of this engineering is that once the process starts, it pretty much sustains itself. The bubbles make the water less dense and it rises on its own. The pipe becomes kind of a self-powered siphon. You start the pump and then the pump isn't needed anymore and then physics just kind of takes over. In 1992, a French team tested this concept at Lake Manoon and it worked. In 1995, they demonstrated it in Nyos. And then in 2001, the U.S. Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance funded a permanent installation in Nyos. 2 more pipes were added in 2011. By 2019, scientists announced that the degassing had reached essentially like a steady state. 1 pipe self-sustaining that was now essentially removing the CO2 at roughly the same rate that the volcanic sources were charging it in the lake. So the lake was being maintained rather than drained. But maintained is not the same as safe. Scientists are careful about that word, especially in the public eye. The lake has been significantly degassed, but not fully. Enough CO2 remains in the deep water that a large enough disturbance, like a major earthquake or a significant landslide, could still trigger some kind of an event. And so the risk is lower than it was in 1986, substantially lower, but it's not quite zero. This is the section I wanted to kind of build towards, and the part that doesn't make it into most coverage. The part that, as a water scientist, I find kind of the most important. So Lake Nyos also has a crumbling wall that you won't often find in some of these other videos. The natural volcanic rock dam that holds the lake in place or keeps the water from draining down from the hillside into the surrounding valleys is unstable. Scientists have known this for decades. A UN assessment in 2005 found that the wall had seriously sagged and warned that it could fail within the next 10 years. It's been about 20 years since that assessment. A failure of that wall would unleash a flood downstream, and depending on how much CO2 remains in the deep water at that exact moment, it could also trigger a gas release as the pressure on the lake drops. A flood and a gas cloud simultaneously, in a valley where people still live. There have been proposals to reinforce this wall or to lower the lake level to, reduce the pressure on it, but neither have been fully implemented. The wall is still there and the CO2 is still recharging. The people downstream are also still there. And then there is a larger question, the one that Lake Nyos opened up and that scientists are still grappling with. How many other lakes are like this? After 1986, scientists surveyed crater lakes around the world looking for other carbon dioxide. They found 3 lakes globally known to be in this condition. So it's Nyos and Manoon, which we both know about in Cameroon, but there's also Lake Kivu on the border between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. Lake Kivu is 2,000 times larger than Nyos. And it sits on the border of 2 nations in an active conflict zone. More than 2 million people on its shores. Its deep waters contain carbon dioxide and methane, a natural gas, which burns. Researchers have debated how serious the risk is at Kivu, and a 2020 study found that earlier risk assessments may have overestimated some CO2 levels. The risk picture is genuinely contested, but the scenario, a lake 2,000 times greater than Lake Nyos in a densely populated region, with flammable gas building in its depths, is not one that anyone who knows the Lake Nyos story can hear without actually feeling something. Paleolimnologists, or scientists that study ancient lake sediments, have also found evidence of what they call Nyos-type events at several other lakes in Europe and Africa, buried in the sediment record. These lakes had limnic eruptions centuries or millennia ago, and they may not be in that condition today, but the history is still there. We identified this type of disaster in only 1986, and we've confirmed that it's happened twice in human history. We know there are other lakes with these same chemical ingredients, and we know that in one case, Lake Nyos, we came within a landslide of never knowing it was possible until nearly 1,800 people were dead. Lake Nyos is covered by a lot of channels as a curiosity or a strange disaster or a weird science story, but I want to leave you with a slightly different frame. What happened at Lake Nyos is a story of a body of water accumulating something dangerous invisibly over decades, and then releasing it in a way that was catastrophic, sudden, and nearly impossible to predict without understanding the chemistry happening below the surface. And as a water scientist, that pattern is not really exotic to me. It's kind of unfortunately familiar. We see variations of this kind of thing constantly, but just in other ways. Lakes accumulating phosphorus in their sediments until they can no longer sustain themselves, and aquifers slowly contaminated over decades before anyone tests the water, and drinking water systems where the risk is invisible until someone gets sick. Water hides things, it holds things, it has secret stories, and sometimes under the right conditions or the wrong ones, it lets them go. Lake Nyos is the most dramatic version of that story pretty much ever recorded, but it's not the only version. And learning to read what's happening beneath the surface of the water that we depend on is the whole point of this show. The survivors of Lake Nyos are still alive. The wall is still standing. The CO2 is still recharging. And yes, the pipes are running and the lake is blue again. But the science of what happened there is still in some ways unfinished, and it may always be. Thanks for being here. I'm Allie, and this is Aqua Diary. Sources are in the show notes as always. And if this episode resonated with you or taught you something, share it with someone who thinks water is boring, because water is literally never boring. It's just quiet about what it's doing, and you have to look a little harder. See you next time, guys. Thank you.